Good evening. Half-Life 2 has reached a legendary status that very few other games have. It's been praised to a point where some people have even gotten sick of it. They've dubbed it overrated and even a glorified tech demo. But not to me. To me, this game still has a beautiful, lively spark in it. It's still bubbling with charm, with humor and wit, with history, and most importantly, with timeless design. Sure, it's won 39 Game of the Year awards, it's a must-play for anyone who owns Steam, and it's probably one of the most highly revered games of all time. There's really no shortage of other videos on YouTube praising the high hell out of this game, but I can't help but feel that neither the old boomer shooter guys on YouTube nor the new age wave of hyper-enthusiastic gamer video essayists have done it the full justice it truly deserves. And I'm not sure I'll be able to either, but in my opinion, Half-Life 2 is actually still criminally underrated. And 20 years later, I still think there's a lot to say about it. Now, I was barely 1 year old when this game originally came out, so it might seem a little strange that it's so special to me, but I've played it so many times in so many forms, and every single time I always find something new to love or admire about it. And in a way, I feel like I grew up with it. There's no denying that Half-Life 2 has had an impact on internet culture that's frankly hard to overstate. It truly helped shape the online environment and culture a lot of us grew up in on an intimate level. Its influence was everywhere online in 2009, and it's still everywhere online now. So just in time for its upcoming big anniversary, and hopefully some kind of official update or documentary or celebration of some kind, I want to finally get some of these thoughts off my chest and hopefully help you understand why this game is so special to me, and why those guys online who say the pistol sounds like poop are actually wrong. Today I want to tell you why, 20 years after its release, Half-Life 2 is still better than you think. Much like most people my age, I was introduced to Half-Life 2 after already being accustomed to seeing the Gman hump people in Gary's mod for years. It's a very backwards way to get into something. It's sort of like becoming a Star Wars fan after being amused by someone who lined all the LEGO spaceship sets into the shape of a willy or something. Regardless, my brain was wired to recognize Gman, Alex, Gordon, Barney, Breen, and Kleiner long before it was ever taught to recognize lame shit like exponents or Oxford commas. And it was a while before I was mentally developed enough to actually bother trying to understand who these guys were or where they came from. When I did finally decide to satiate my curiosity as to who this bald guy in glasses was, I unintentionally stumbled into a bottomless rabbit hole of lore and history that since then has gripped me for years and years. I traced Gmod back to Half-Life 2, back to Half-Life 1, back to Quake, all the way back to the genesis of the first-person shooter genre, and I can only imagine there's a ton of others like me who might not have ever heard of Half-Life or cared for FPS games as a genre if they weren't hooked in by the goofy fun of TF2 and Gmod. Now, I'm not going to try to convince you that the main reason Half-Life 2 is great is because it was super duper influential, and if you find it boring, it's just because every game is like Half-Life 2 now. Because A, I feel like that's already been said in a million other videos, and B, I don't actually think it's that true. It's not like having a gravity gun became industry standard for every single game since 2004, although it certainly seems having annoying guys talk your ear off has. I'd say Half-Life 2 is more like classic Fallout. We all know it was a genre-defining experience back in the day, but the industry surrounding it has mostly led itself in a different direction. I imagine it's because the game's formula was so unique and it was executed so well that it just doesn't make sense to tread the same ideas again. Why bother making Half-Life 2 again, but worse this time? The main thing I'll always appreciate most about Half-Life 2 is what it did to influence online culture, but I do still think it's a great game beneath that, and there's no better way to prove it than to simply demonstrate how it improved upon its already great predecessor. Half-Life 1 was revolutionary in a lot of ways. I would go as far as to say it was the first first-person shooter game to be actually playable by a human being and not a fucking gross alien bug thing. But the biggest way it was revolutionary, as I'm sure you've heard before, is in its story. Half-Life 1 introduced the masses to the exhilarating world of getting on a train to go to fucking work. And I know that sounds like I'm being funny, but that was actually a pretty big deal for a genre where, up until that point, pretty much every game's immediate first impression upon putting in the CD was you are getting shot at, shoot back or die. With the closest thing to a story being some completely optional wall of text that felt like something the developer scribbled on a McDonald's napkin 15 seconds before launch. Furthermore, Half-Life 1 introduced the FPS genre to human NPCs who would actually speak lines of voice dialogue at you and follow you around and even fight alongside you. I guess Duke Nukem had strippers and stuff, but that's not really the same as an actual gameplay ally, more of a moral one. Of all the NPCs Half-Life 1 introduced us to, perhaps none are as memorable as the G-Man. A pretty shady, suited gentleman who would watch you from a distance and was seemingly behind whatever plot made this resonance cascade and alien invasion happen in the first place. However, what I think a lot of people don't realize is that the original incarnation of G-Man and his mystery from Half-Life 1 are very shallow. He was straightforward straightforwardly written to be nothing more than a vaguely spooky head administrator of Black Mesa, hence the logo on a suitcase, and the contents of his briefcase are easily discovered via no-clip to be nothing but a couple of pencils and a handgun. It's a bit insane to think that at one point this was all that existed of the G-Man's mystery. There's a line from the ending of Half-Life 1 that always kind of stuck out to me.
I took the liberty of relieving you of your weapons. Most of them were government property.
Coming back to Half-Life 1 with the context of how the rest of the series treats him, it's so weird to see him portrayed so one-dimensionally. Yep, he's the G-Man, the government man. He acts on behalf of the US government. That's it, apparently. I guess the furthest implication you could have drawn from his character back then was that he was some kind of alien spy who had infiltrated the military industry. From what I can tell, he was basically nothing more than a giant reference to an X-Files character referred to as the Seaman. And he was still probably the most interesting character in the game. The others were just comic relief doofuses you were supposed to either feel bad for or laugh at when they made funny scream noises. But Half-Life 2 changed everything. Half-Life 2 pushed the narrative scope even further. It had actual named characters with unique motivations, fears, recurring scenes, and at times Oscar-worthy performances from real Hollywood actors. Not to say the characters we heard from in Half-Life 1 weren't memorable themselves, but there's a scene with Alex's voice actor Merle Dandridge at the end of one of the Half-Life 2 expansions that, without spoiling anything, still comes to mind as one of the best acting performances I've ever heard in any video game. Heading back to the G-Man in particular, I don't ever see anyone give flowers to Half-Life 2 for the way it completely transformed this one-note briefcase government guy into one of the greatest, most iconic video game mysteries of all time. It's really quite the doozy Valve did here. G-Man was effectively split into two different characters for Half-Life 2. No longer is he the shady, mysterious Black Mesa manager. Instead, that role was reworked for a new character, Dr. Wallace Breen, controlling humanity from the top of his lonely tower. A lot of people say his speeches to the public are really him trying to convince himself he made the right choice with his Faustian bargain, trading humanity's freedom for its continued existence. But the case you hear him lay out throughout the game is surprisingly compelling, and in the context of the greater story, does make you question late into the game when it's far too late to change anything, whether you are actually doing the right thing.
Tell me, Dr. Freeman, if you can. You have destroyed so much. What is it exactly that you have created? Can you name even one thing?
G-Man himself, meanwhile, has matured into an outright interdimensional Time Lord. He feels so much more complex. His sightings and speeches are infinitely more creepy and interesting, and his motive much more mysterious and puzzling. Half-Life 2's depiction of the G-Man forever defines his character. It made the mystery of his suitcase so much more interesting. We can assume the gun and sci-fi panel shown in Half-Life 1 is probably no longer canon, and to me the suitcase has instead come to be a physical symbol of his shady interdimensional dealings. I won't give any spoils for Half-Life Alyx, but it spells this out even further. Long before it became an icon of the Interloper creepypasta, I admired this generic graffiti texture as a really cool element of G-Man's mystery. 20 years later, the world has gone gray, but this guy still looks exactly the same. He's still making moves and acting his cryptic agenda all over the world, and you're not the only one who notices him. You remember how I said I knew what these characters were through Gmod before I ever knew them from Half-Life 2? Well, thankfully, their designs are so well made that the transition is actually very easy. Their designs already tell you a lot about who they are before they even open their mouths. You can immediately tell from his demeanor and how he's dressed that G-Man is a serious guy who does serious stuff. And that's why him riding a bathtub motorcycle in Gmod is comical even to people who don't know anything about him or the series he's from. The same isn't quite true of his Half-Life 1 iteration. He was surreal and interesting, but because he was so cartoony and blocky, and sometimes would whip out a cell phone or run away when you shot at him in the demo, he wasn't really that ominous or sinister in the way his successor was. As far as I'm concerned, all of Half-Life 2's characters were devised with a similar level of genius craftsmanship. Seriously, shout out to this game's character designers. Just look at Kleiner and Eli and how perfectly their visuals map to their personalities. Kleiner's lab coat and glasses symbolize his almost delusional attachment to his past as a scientist at Black Mesa, contrasting with Eli's practical green military vest and missing leg signaling his guerrilla experience and focus on practicality. Just from their visual designs, you can immediately understand how these two people would balance each other out to be a good leading duo for the Resistance in a sci-fi world. Alex's Black Mesa hoodie works well as a nod to her father's past. It makes sense that when tailing it out of Black Mesa, some of the only clothing Eli would be able to find would be company-branded shirts like this. Judith Mossman is one of my favorite examples. She's just a little too polished looking compared to the other characters. While everyone else is wearing dirty, scrappy clothes, Mossman rocks this conspicuous, clean-cut beige turtleneck and even some jewelry, which serves as a subtle hint to the player early on that she's actually a Combine spy. Now, plenty of other games have well-designed characters too, obviously, but in Half-Life 2, even the generic NPCs are excellent. The rebels and citizens being sourced from real streetwalkers Valve approached outside their building in Seattle makes them downtrodden and relatable in an immediately charming way. I remember being blown away as a kid when I first put it together that the gear on the Resistance members was actually repurposed from fallen Metro Cops. There's just something so distinct about these designs. In my opinion, they might be the best generic human NPC civilians in any game. None of the Half-Life Alyx NPCs will ever exceed these guys, and unfortunately neither will the characters in Gary Newman's Gmod successor Sandbox, regardless of how much I fancy the bloke. Halo 7 was simply lightning in a bottle. How many other nameless character models like that can you make videos about that get millions of views 20 years later? I see a lot of people online complain that Half-Life 2 demands you pretend you always knew its characters, who are total fabrications and retcons of generic NPCs from Half-Life 1, and while there is some truth to it being a little awkward how far Valve stretched to try and bring old recognizable characters into their new narrative set 20 years later in a completely different region of the world, Barney Calhoun and Dr. Kleiner were already established names in Half-Life 1's canon, so I personally don't really see it as too hard to believe that they had a friend named Eli, who happened to be this guy you met at the start of Half-Life 1, and that he might have had an infant daughter who he and Kleiner escaped with. In particular, this complaint feels a bit overstated to me because it's hard for me to imagine that anyone who followed Half-Life in the years up to its sequel's release would have been just totally bewildered and confused by the characters of Barney and Kleiner. And I never see people raise this complaint against other games of the era that did the same thing, like Halo 2 that came out that same year, which retconned the generic military NPCs from Halo 1 into specific guys named Avery Johnson and Marcus Stacker. I do actually like how these characters are introduced, too. I think they're very important in helping give you a familiar tether to your old journey in this completely brand new setting. So I guess ultimately my question to the Half-Life 2 haters out there, those who hate this stretch Valve made to satisfy their narrative ambitions for their sequel, would you prefer if they didn't try anything daring like this, and if Half-Life 2 was instead simply another crude story about a giant science facility getting overrun with aliens? If so, I have about 100 bajillion skibadillion other games to sell you. Another thing I don't think Half-Life 2 gets its proper dues for is how ambitious its world was. Half-Life 1's world was a bit like a comic book. It was this colorful sci-fi experience with some occasional hints of extraterrestrial horror, pulling you through this huge monolithic facility as it unravels around you. That's another one of the ways Half-Life 1 revolutionized immersion in the FPS genre. It created a seamless experience where every level led directly into the next. Gordon's journey through the entirety of Black Mesa was believably connected, and there were no arcadey stat screens telling you how many kills you got in the last stage, interrupting the flow. But Half-Life 2 takes this so much further. Not only does it offer a mostly seamless experience front to back, it does so in a game that takes place on a much larger scale. And I think scale really is the key word here. Instead of one big old facility and a few alien islands, Half-Life 2 takes us through an entire city, coast, and wasteland. And it's all oriented around this massive tower that directs you and subtly signals your progression through the whole game. It's really a far cry from the narrow corridor shooters that preceded it. Of course, a big part of this was the technology Half-Life 2's proprietary Source engine brought forward. The innovation of the 3D skybox literally gives every single map the illusion of being bigger than it is. APCs pulling up from the highways just out of bounds, cops rappelling down off bridges you can't access and setting up roadblocks, even helicopters flying in and out of the level without disappearing into thin air like they did in Half-Life 1. This illusion of a bigger world is portrayed so well that some of my friends unironically believed Half-Life 2 to be open world when they were younger, as if they could climb over any hill and the game would go on from there. Today we don't appreciate these jumps in technology because they've become the modern standard. We sort of take them for granted. But in the context of the series, back in 2004, this was a big deal. Beyond the factor of scale, I've always thought that although Half-Life 2 is certainly not any super insightful or preachy think piece, its aesthetics and its writing reflect societal concerns that might be more realistic to the average person than lab experiments gone wrong and civilians getting eaten by freakish aliens, or at least more sophisticated than the entire military is evil and can't spell. Government overreach, surveillance, the depletion of natural resources, rotten government housing, genocide, indescribable evil. It's no secret that 1984 by George Orwell was a major inspiration for Half-Life 2. The book is even present in an unused trash texture. And even if it isn't actually so much more of a statement than the plot of Half-Life 1, the game's narrative and visual style feel more downstream from real social commentary, and generally give the game a sophisticated and mature vibe. What we see in City 17 is probably the most beautiful example of this. The visual of Combine technology affixed to commie blocks, it literally physically connects symbols of the Combine's alien oppression to historical icons of human authoritarianism and oppression. It's a lot more thoughtful than I think most people give it credit for. One thing a lot of people say Half-Life 1 trumps Half-Life 2 on is gameplay, but I actually completely disagree here. I think Half-Life 2 has a lot of great things going for it in its gameplay, and I think it offers a way more refined experience. Don't get me wrong, the fun variety of laser and bioweapons Half-Life 1 handed the player were entertaining in their own right. They just unfortunately had the downside of not actually being that useful throughout most of the game, and some of them certainly felt a lot like gimmicks. You'd always run out of ammo quick on the cool laser weapons you actually wanted to use, and instead be stuck using the damn hive hand. Half-Life 2 has a smaller arsenal, but sometimes less is more. Instead of 6 situationally useful gimmick weapons, you get one universally awesome gimmick gun that easily trumps every gimmick weapon in Half-Life Half-Life 1 combined, the gravity gun. While running out of ammo with your real guns in Half-Life 1 could be seriously annoying, being stuck with just the gravity gun is meanwhile an actually really cool experience. One that people enjoyed so much that Valve made 2 fun-ass achievements based entirely around it. Hell, one guy made an entire best-selling game out of it. Another massive gameplay improvement Half-Life 2 brought was in its grenades. The nades in the original game were super clunky and janky, while the grenades in Half-Life 2 feel much more intuitive because they interface with an actual physics engine. And who could forget the addition of ragdoll physics, which make any and all attacks involving explosive power super entertaining. It never gets old. One of my favorite examples of this is the 357. Ragdoll physics give this weapon one of the most satisfying introductions of any weapon in any game. If you don't like how Valve sanded down Half-Life 2's arsenal compared to Half-Life 1, that's completely fair, but I think it does make sense for it to be less bombastic given that it's a less comical and cartoony game. I know some people take issues with the vehicle segments, they think they go on too long. I personally think they're both actually great fun. What's not to love about running over Metro cops with CP violation blaring? It certainly beats Half-Life 1's train segment that is straight up more fun if you just ignore the train. I think probably the actual worst segment in Half-Life 2 is the City 17 Uprising chapters. They were notoriously rushed, and there are some areas where the art on the levels is clearly not finished to the degree the rest of the game is. But even these levels, for their faults, have plenty of great highlights and are not even half as grueling of an experience as Zen was in the original Half-Life. Plus, they lead you directly into the finale of Half-Life 2, which also blows the sluggishness of Zen out of the water. It gives you this really fun, exciting power trip that feels truly climactic and doesn't rely on low-gravity FPS platforming. Half-Life 1's NPCs and AI set a high bar with their intelligence and memorable interactions. They didn't simply populate the game world, they felt alive, dynamic, and leagues ahead of the usual cannon fodder in other shooters. These guys had AI for smelling meat, and they had an actual observable food chain. If they didn't see the player, they would attack each other in a way that made sense. Half-Life 2 doesn't quite shoot for that crazy, dynamic, interactive AI that Half-Life 1 had, but it has AI that is, in a lot of ways, much more polished and advanced. The Combine flank, they rotate, they take cover, they flush you out with nades. They can fire their gun while moving, and perhaps most importantly, they don't get stuck in doorways and blow themselves up like the HECU sometimes do. It's insane to think their AI was almost even smarter. I was recently informed by true Valve Patriot C. Marty that the Combine were apparently originally programmed by Lars Leden, but when Lars left Valve in 2002, the pieces of his work had to be picked up by Steve Bond, leading to some of Lars's AI innovations winding up on the cutting room floor. The lore behind these enemies is also just way more interesting. The Half-Life 1 Marines are just US Marines. Even after an entire expansion of questionable canonicity, they are honestly still kind of just a boring generic military faction. In both backstory and visual design, the Combine are a much more iconic and unique foe that effortlessly feel much more imposing. There's a reason that Half-Life Alyx brought us back into the series with glimpses of the Combine instead of the HECU. The Combine and City 17 redefined this series' identity forever. I actually don't think I can overstate just how memorable Half-Life 2's grunt enemy designs are. As far as I'm concerned, the Combine Elite and Metro Cop are 2 of the top 5 hardest enemy designs in video game history, and they ain't 3, 4, or 5. Half-Life 2 doesn't have quite the wide cast of aliens that the original game did, but it does still have some great enemy variety. Instead of just zombies and head crabs, we have fast zombies, poison zombies, fast and poison head crabs, and they each behave and need to be dealt with differently. The fact that head crabs have been harnessed into a bioweapon by the Combine is also really cool. Over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of great videos made about the small details in Half-Life 2's story, but there's something I have personally never seen mentioned, and I'm sorry if it was very obvious to you, but I only realized it a few years ago. Have you ever paid attention to the peculiar way the characters in the early game of Half-Life 2 discuss Gordon's return?
Gordon Freeman! I expected more warning.
Yeah, you and me both, Doc.
Funny, you showing up on this day in particular.
That's not who I think it is it?
None of these characters seem as surprised at the sudden return of Gordon Freeman as you'd expect them to be. They're seemingly instead surprised at how soon it came. They all act like they were expecting Gordon, as if it was some kind of prophecy that he would return. Needless to say, since nobody had heard from him in over 20 years, this is really peculiar. My theory is that Gordon's return was part of some kind of pact that the higher-ups in the Resistance made with the G-Man. Perhaps the Vortigaunts were involved, and the deal was brokered in a desperate plea to save humanity. What the Resistance could have possibly offered G-Man in return, I don't know. I don't know how the Resistance could have known Gordon to be in stasis and not dead either. But there is dialogue suggesting that both Eli and Kleiner know of G-Man and his dealings, though one admittedly comes from an earlier leaked build of the game. The central narrative of Half-Life 2 is Gordon trying to carry out his true allegiance to free his species, while being kept on a leash by the G-Man, who has his own motives. That's why Breen's dialogue is so compelling. Gordon really has no idea what the fuck he's doing because he was just killing a giant baby thing a few hours ago, and hasn't had a chance to consider the future on a cerebral level like Breen has. He's just filling the role G-Man has placed him in. Dr. Breen is is 100% right when he calls Gordon a puppet. And the fact he even seemingly alludes to the fact G-Man was keeping him in stasis only makes Breen's case more persuasive.
I have good reason to believe that in the intervening years, he was in a state that precluded further development of covert skills.
The ultimate hypocrisy, though, is that Breen is really no less of a puppet than Gordon. He too is manipulated by forces beyond his understanding or control. In his case, the mysterious Combine advisors. We don't know much about these highly intelligent psychokinetic beings other than that they're higher up in the Combine command chain than Breen, but even they are still visibly subjugated and enslaved. The Vortigons call them Shu'ulathoi. One of the most fascinating fan theories I know of in the Half-Life community is that G-Man is actually a shape-shifted Shu'ulathoi who was never enslaved by the Combine, and his motive is to free his species. This would explain why the Combine being destroyed would be convenient enough for G-Man to allow under the terms of whatever deal he made with the Resistance. Maybe the G-Man wants the Combine gone too, but not because he champions humanity, rather because it's in the interests of his people. Another thing that's very striking to me about Half-Life 2's early game is just how barren the state of humanity is shown to be. Gordon is the most important anti-citizen to ever exist, and he's the #1 priority for the Combine, yet human civilization is so splintered and the population is so low that his high-stakes chase with the world government feels more like he's on a run from local police in a forest out in some rural country. With the people of Earth so sparse and powerless, the police force has no reason to be prepared to take on a threat as competent as Gordon in his supersuit. It's very stark and existential in a way Half-Life 1 wasn't. Half-Life 1 also didn't have any depictions of suicide. Between that and the consoling couple, it's a bit crazy how earnest Half-Life 2 gets in its depictions of humanity's anguish compared to its predecessor. It always makes me think back to this segment from an article by Ashley Pomeroy. I'll put it on screen for those who care to read it. One of my least favorite things Half-Life 2's detractors like to do is call it a glorified tech demo because it shows off its physics engine so much. I really just find this so snide and reductionist, especially because you can totally reduce Half-Life 1 to gimmicks in the same way if you really want to be a dick. Whole chapters of that game were about showing off the fact that Valve's character models had advanced skeleton systems with mouths that moved, or that they had colored lighting systems or moving geometry. Sure, this puzzle with the seesaw is a bit contrived, but so is this entire chapter set exclusively in the Black Mesa squish the hell out of shit for no reason department. There's also a popular idea that Half-Life 2 is originally going to be a much more mature and depressing experience, and that the final game is comparatively bubbly, childish, and optimistic. I'm not so sure that's true though. While the original drafts of Half-Life 2 were going to be more blunt in their depictions of violence and the destitute state of the planet, the tone of the writing and characters at times seemed frankly a lot sillier than what we got. The generic NPCs seemed to be treated more like the Half-Life 1 scientists. Their deaths were funny punchlines.
You could cover Manrich. He'll take care of the rest.
You want
Get
me?
back,
You want some of me?
roams the street.
Manrich is down! Manrich!
I think a lot of this is people getting caught up in the concept art, which I can't blame them for because Victor Antonov's work on the earlier drafts of Half-Life 2 was phenomenal. But you know what else was phenomenal? Victor Antonov's work on the final drafts of Half-Life 2. There's plenty of art floating around from the later stages of Half-Life 2's development too, and they're criminally underrated. I think they really helped prove this game wound up on the right track in the end. To the beta fans amongst us, obviously I'm not telling you to stop enjoying the early drafts of Half-Life 2. I've made my own video talking about how mystifying they are. But if you want to play a very fun and atmospheric, green, apocalyptic sci-fi game with child slavery, I wholeheartedly recommend you go check out Fallout 3. That's probably the game you're longing for. The final angle I want to defend Half-Life 2 from is from those who believe its episodic expansions to be better. Now, Episode 1 and 2 are great experiences. Certain characters really develop and come into their own. There's tons of really good gameplay and atmosphere. These games are some of the best the series has to offer. Unfortunately, though, I still can't help but view the episodes as failures compared to Half-Life 2. The episodic model infamously failed Valve, and it failed their fans, which is why if we get another Half-Life game, it will be Half-Life 3 and not Episode 3. I also take issue with the story direction of the episodes a bit. The original writer of Half-Life 1 and 2, Mark Laidlaw, once said that jamming Portal and Half-Life into the same universe didn't make any sense and made both games feel smaller, and I can't help but agree. I think connecting Portal to the Half-Life universe was a bit of a mistake. There's this awkward tone disparity between the two franchises that I imagine is part of why it's been so hard for them to continue the story of either. I have a few other qualms with the episode's story too. When Half-Life 2 came out, a lot of people on online forums were distraught because the obvious implication was that in the conclusion, Alex and Eli and everyone else in the Citadel died in its explosion. It was actually really interesting thematically, the innocent dying while Gordon, who was complicit in the experiment that doomed humanity in the first place, gets away just because he was compromised by the G-Man. It's wonderfully fucked up, and it set up a new slate for Half-Life 3 just in the way Half-Life 1 did for its sequel. Now, I can't say for sure that they always explicitly intended all of these characters to die. There were apparently unused dialogue lines from Episode 1 implying that escape pods exist on the Citadel that people like Mossman and Eli could have used. But the implication of this huge explosion right next to Alex's face was very clear to people back in 2004. So much so that even back then, fans of the character immediately started asking for a prequel starring her. I found one very funny post from the time of a guy submitting his theory that once Valve saw the love Alex got from the game's fans, they would cheaply undo her death and put her on the box art of the next game to market it with her return. Surely they would never... Sure enough, these characters were seemingly too beloved by both the fans and the devs for an ending this drastic and depressing to stand. So Half-Life 2 Episode 1 opens with the Vortigaunts being used as an excuse to save Alex through literal time control, an ability they weren't revealed to have until this exact moment. It really takes a lot of the punch out of the ending of Half-Life 2, but I still think this would be pretty easy to forgive on its own. After all, I think we're probably better off living in a world where the entire Half-Life 2 cast gets to live for more than one short game. Additionally, I can't pretend that the whole sequence with the purple Vortigaunts doesn't look cool as fuck. Half-Life has always had a way of making up for strange writing choices with its cool-ass visual presentation. My greater issue is that the episodes backtrack like this a lot. They repeatedly use the Vortigaunts to fake out the death of Alex and her father Eli. Out in the middle of nowhere, Alex gets eviscerated by a hunter, but because one Vortigaunt was apparently nearby, she manages to heal back up. But then suddenly Eli dies right outside a base full of Vortigaunts, and for some reason this one is permanent and can't be time fixed, and fuck you, there's no follow-up for 15 years. I do realize Eli getting his brain eaten is a little more permanent than getting impaled through your stomach, but now that I'm older, I've started to view the Vortigaunts as a bit of a deus ex machina. They steer the plot wherever Valve needs it to go with the flimsy excuse of paranormal magic. In a series that's nominally supposed to be about science and shit, which bugs me a bit because we already had a guy in the story who does that. And with the ending of Half-Life Alyx especially, I feel like it's only getting more and more ridiculous how many times they've killed people and then said, never mind. I would obviously still recommend the episodes to any and everyone in a heartbeat. Episode 1's hospital chapter more than makes up for the pitfalls of the Uprising chapters in Half-Life 2, and Episode 2 has what I think is probably the best vehicle segment in the entire series. I might even wind up making a video about these games on their own eventually, because there really are some great qualities and outstanding moments in both of them. But to me, the episodes, with all their time travel retcons and fake-outs and their glaringly incomplete story, they could never outclass the distilled greatness of the original Half-Life 2. You can enjoy it front to back. There's no caveats. There's no big crossover moments with other franchises. It's just good and stands on its own. At this point in the video, I originally planned to include a big old wish list for the then prospective 20th anniversary update, but as I wrote in the disclaimer at the start, I unfortunately wasn't able to finish this video in time due to some obligations in my personal life. But what do you know? Valve did indeed do a huge 20th anniversary update, and also, it appears they added literally every single thing I wrote down as a wish in my script. Like, literally everything. The old fire effects, redone lighting, a documentary, a greater glimpse into the pre-release stages and development of the game. It's almost creepy, like they read my mind or something. So yeah, hats off to Valve and the no-clip documentary team for giving fans like me exactly what we wanted and more. Also, it struck me while editing this that because the public attitude around Half-Life 2 has become so unabashedly positive since this anniversary celebration, I might sound like an insane person for going so far out of my way to defend it throughout this video, but I promise you this game has not always been as universally praised in the community as it has been for the last few weeks. There have for a long time been huge groups of people in the Half-Life community who insist Half-Life 2 wasn't actually good compared to Half-Life 1 or other shooters of the time. I actually do still think these people will come out again soon once the party dies down a little more, but for now they seem to have been forced into a retreat by the current Half-Life 2 Chad dominance. When they do come back though, this video will be there for them to argue with and call me mean words over. I've probably rambled long enough, but if I had to describe Half-Life 2 in a simple way, it would be larger than life. Because there are so many ways in which Half-Life 2 is bigger than itself, if that makes any sense. The at the time ambitious technology effectively sells you on the illusion that the game world is bigger than it really is. The legends of its development and its never materializing sequel create this surrounding mythos that keeps people hooked even once they're done with the game itself. I mean really, I think the only sequel more hyped than Half-Life 3 is GTA 6. The critical role Half-Life 2 had in helping Valve launch Steam, the biggest online gaming platform in the world, means the fruits of its labor have had an impact even on gamers who have never played a Valve game before. Similarly, there's the golden lineage of Valve games and fan mods that followed it and all built their own wonderful experiences from its baseboard. Gmod, TF2, Left 4 Dead, all phenomenal experiences in their own right that owe dues to Half-Life 2 and the technology it brought forward. And each of these experiences also carry their own memes and culture and mythos that have permeated the internet for decades. Between the millions of people who have played Source Engine games over the last 20 years, how many Gmod RP memories have been made? How many many unforgettable funny moments in TF2. How many amateur maps and mods made by ambitious teenagers carrying on lives of their own? How many careers in programming, modeling, or level design inspired by admiration of the world of Half-Life 2 and its sons? I mean shit, without Half-Life 2 I wouldn't even have a channel to deliver this message to you from. If you've ever enjoyed any Source Engine memes, if you've ever laughed at Shrek is Love, Shrek is Life, or anything related to Skibbity Toilet, you owe Half-Life 2 a nod of reverence. Those experiences wouldn't exist without it. Anyways, to finally wrap this all up, as a kid, Half-Life 2 and its babies like TF2 and Gmod transformed me and millions of others into completely unadulterated Valve super fanboys. Nowadays, as an adult who is not particularly interested in VR or MOBAs or card games or Steam couches, I admit I look at them as a bit more fallible. But I'll always be appreciative of Half-Life 2 and what the team of devs behind it accomplished and brought to the world through it. I'm truly sorry if this video made me come off as a Half-Life 1 hater, by the way. I'm really not. I actually love that game nearly just as much as Half-Life 2. And there's no denying that Half-Life 2 wouldn't have been able to have the impact it did without the blueprint of its daddy from '98. It's just that Half-Life 1 was before my time. It's not how I was introduced to the series, and I do think a lot of the things its fans say Half-Life 2 is poor for are unfair. The ultimate point I'm trying to make is that Half-Life 2 really is an excellent game. A potent, vivacious-ass game that has 100% earned its spot in all the top 50 games of all time lists it's appeared in. And I am confident that it will continue to subtly influence online culture for decades to come, because it is a great experience, and this has been my video on why Half-Life 2 is a good game, and it makes me smile, and some of you guys are just mean. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more, and have a good day.